Hi, thanks for tuning in. In this video I'm going to put together a really basic synth patch on Softube Modular. So this is if you're new to Modular and you kind of look through the presets maybe, but don't really know where to start with your own design. And we're going to take a look at a very simple one oscillator patch, kind of look at the modules in detail and put them together and see what we can make. If you'd like to support what we're doing, then check out the links in the video description. You can check out our music. It's Hue, H-U-W, and you can find us on Spotify, Bandcamp, Apple Music. If you want to check us out on Twitter, it's Hue_music, and Facebook, we're Hue Book. So yeah, please do check out the links below. So here in Modular, Softube Modular, I'm going to take the default setting. When I boot it up, I'm going to be faced with this array of modules. So where do I start? I'm going to start down here with Midi to CV. Midi is a digital instruction, and in the real world, CV is an analog voltage, control voltage, and obviously this is a simulation, but this is where we convert the information from our Midi keyboard controller and convert that into usable voltages for our modular synth. And taking a look at what's available, you can see that we've got the note, the pitch, we've got gates and triggers, which are kind of time-based instructions. When is this happening? We've got velocity, that's the speed you hit the key, and that translates into the volume that you hear. We've got pitch bend, sliding between notes. We've got a mod wheel. Mod is modulation, and that allows us to adjust things during the performance to give an expression. Aftertouch is another element of kind of expressive playing, and that's where we could press the key a little harder after that initial strike, and we can apply some more expression to our performance that way. So where do we start with the synth modules themselves? Well, I'm going to add this. Let's take a look at the VCO, Voltage Controlled Oscillator, and this is the wave that we're going to be placing in our single voice synthesizer today. So here we are, a fair few controls to look at, and I thought it might be good to initially just take a look at what's happening under the hood in this oscillator. So let's go through the controls. We've got a range, and if I patch in this saw wave, you can hear that wave sounding. Let's take a look at what these controls do. So adjusts our octave, musical octave. We've got a fine tune. And we've also got a second CV input here. There's the input, and there's the initial setting, and we can offset that by feeding a voltage into this input here. That will apply also to the tuning of the oscillator. We'll take a look a little later at this PW. Again, two of them to kind of sum together to make adjustments, and that's pulse width. That only applies to this square wave here, but we'll take a look at that in detail later on. These four waveforms, they're kind of our building blocks for our synth voice, so let's have a little listen to each of them. Square, triangle, sine wave. And already you can hear they've got really individual characteristics, and kind of mixing those waves together, modulating them over time. That's what's going to give us our very unique, our own synthesizer voice when we build our patch. The next module we're going to add into our circuit is this filter. This is a VCF, or voltage controlled filter. Let's add one of these. This is where we can adjust the timbre, the tone of the sound. And again, this is subtractive synthesis. So just like before where we saw that the waveform was always playing, we're going to take away from that and close a gate over it over time so that it only sounds when we want it to. We're going to open that gate and listen to the signal over a particular period of time. we're also only going to listen to certain frequencies, and we filter those frequencies with a voltage controlled filter. It's got a few outputs, an audio input. We can also control with a CV the frequency itself, and again there's two controls for that we can kind of sum together for weird and wonderful adjustments in frequency. But initially let's just take a listen. If we put in that saw wave and place it in to the audio input, let's take a look at what these various outputs do to the sound. Look at the abbreviations and see what they mean. So up at the top we've got a BP, that's a band pass. So that's just going to let through a certain band of frequencies. And we can choose that band. This frequency dial up here. The remaining outputs here all say LP next to them, and that stands for low pass. It's going to let all of the low frequencies pass and none of the high, and gradually that's going to change as we adjust the starting point for that filter. So let's take a look. We've got 48 dB low pass. Here, as I raise the frequency dial, it's letting more and more of the high frequencies through. We've got the same effect, but with 24 decibels. 12 dB. This is how many decibels per octave at the point of filtering, and then 6 dB. So it's basically how steep is the curve of the filter, how steep or shallow is it. The higher the number, the more extreme the adjustment. We've also got down here emph, that's emphasis, and that's our resonance. So at the point at which the filter begins to shelve the frequencies, you can increase, make a little bump in that, and that kind of gives us a beautiful kind of cutting, ringing sound to the adjustment. And we'll look at that later on when we kind of start to get something a bit more musical. So we talked about the oscillator always sounding. How are we going to control that so that it only happens when we play a note? And part of that is going to be this, our VCA, or voltage controlled amplifier. So let's put that in and have a look at what we've got. This is a dual VCA. That means there's two units. And you can see here this line here denotes that's one unit there, that's one amplifier. And here's another one. Now in this very simple synth, I'm just going to use one of them. In later videos I may use 2, I may use 3, I may use 4. The possibilities are endless, but just to get a handle on the principles of it, we're just going to use one today. So let's have a look at the controls on this one. We've got the gain pot here. Well, that's the actual volume itself of the amplifier. And obviously we can move that, physically move it, and that will raise or lower the sound. But what we can do here with our control voltage, we can feed that a voltage that opens and closes that amplifier over time. And that's, again, this subtractive idea. So we're going to take away from that oscillator constantly sounding, and if we do that over time, we're going to get a kind of musical playable note, because it's going to open up the amp and then close it again, so that we kind of hear the sound coming in and out. Let's wire that up and do it manually and have a listen to what it does. I'm going to place the signal from the filter into the amplifier. I'm going to take the output of the amp and feed that to the main out of our module. And here we are with the gain pot. Let's move this over time and have a listen. There you have it, the beginnings of a subtractive synthesizer. What you can hear there is we've chosen a linear fade on our gain pot. You've got linear here, lin, or exponential. Now a linear fade is a straight line from silence to the top. When that happens, as you raise the gain pot, it's in equal measurements from the beginning to the end. If we choose an exponential curve, you'll hear that it takes a lot longer for the perception of the loudness to come in, because it's very quiet, very quiet, very quiet, very quiet, very quiet, very quiet, a good bit louder, really loud. So in my amplifier today, I'm going to choose a linear curve, so that as we open that gain pot over time, it's going to come in and out very obviously. And you'll hear how that works when we put in our next module. This next one, it's the Adsr envelope generator. So this is what's going to open and close the amplifier over time. So this is a time-based unit. And let's take a look at the controls on this one. We have here a few dials. We've got A, that stands for attack. D, that stands for decay. S is sustain. And R is release. Let's take a look at those in detail. So I'm going to patch in this so that we can have a look at how they work. So I'll talk you through the patching first, and then we can kind of look at these in action. So back to our Midi to CV unit here. We need to get something usable so that we can open and close the amp at the moment that we play a note. And I think at this point it might as well be worth kind of getting a musical note to play as well. So let's put together the beginnings of our synth voice. We're going to take a note from the Midi to CV. I'm going to feed that into the CV1 input of our oscillator. Now, just to demonstrate what that's done, if I open the amp, at the moment, again, there's no envelope on the amplifier, it's just playing all the time. That oscillator is sounding. We haven't subtracted away from that amplifier yet. But what we can do is adjust the notes now. So now if I play some notes on my keyboard, although the note continues to play, you can hear that I'm able to change the pitch. The next thing we need to do is place that envelope over the amplifier so that we can open and close it over time. And we're going to do that by telling it when we're pressing a note, and we're going to use the gate to do that. Let's put a gate signal straight into that envelope's gate input. Now we're going to output this particular envelope onto the amplifier of our synth. Place it into the CV input on the amp. And then again, we've got our filter playing the filtered sound into the amplifier, a gate triggering an envelope, the output of which is feeding the amplifier's CV input. I'm going to close the amplifier. That's fully closed. So until this CV input receives a signal, there will be no output from the amplifier. Let's patch that into the main out. There we are. Nothing happening right now. I'm going to play some notes on my keyboard. There's a couple of things dictating how long it plays for. Initially, it's the Adsr envelope of this envelope generator, and also combined with how long I hold the note down for. If I sustain the note, it's going to play for as long as I hold the note for. Then when I let go, it's going to get to that final stage of its envelope. Let's take a look at that in more detail. The attack phase. If I've got a really short attack, when I play the note, it's going to come in straight away. Let's adjust that attack. The slower the attack, the longer it's going to take for that amplifier gain pot to open, because that envelope is adjusting this pot here. So how long does it take to raise this value on the gain on the amplifier? The decay. Once we've reached the end of the attack phase, how long does it take to fall down to the sustain phase. That's when we hold down the note. It's interesting to note that the sustain phase is not a time-based value. It's actually the volume of the note when it's being held down. So if I have a short delay, and we can have a listen to this sustain phase. If I drop that sustain, I'll drop it a little further again, just to accentuate, just to accent that change. And you can hear there, the note came in. It took a little bit of time to dip down to a volume that was a little quieter than the end of the attack phase. And then the release time, how long does it take to close the amp once I've let go of the key? I'll raise that. I'll raise my sustain a bit so you can kind of hear it a bit better. I'll also lengthen the release time. So just to repeat, the attack, how long does it take to open this amplifier? Decay, once I've opened it up, how long does it take to come down to the volume, the setting here that I've set in my sustain? So in this instance, down to there. And then release, once I let go of the note, how long does it take for this gain value to drop back down to nothing? Let's have a listen to these values. The time values, obviously you've just got 0 to 10. So to enable you to have longer or shorter time ranges, there's a switch here that kind of changes the ratios of these time-based elements of the envelope generator. Okay. Hopefully that's made lots of sense. And we've kind of got a simple synth voice happening right there. But it doesn't sound very interesting. We could maybe set the frequency to a different place, maybe adjust the emphasis, and change the timbre of the sound, but it's still really static. It's not doing anything other than opening and closing over time. What's going to make our voice a little more interesting to the ear is to make some modulation of these things happen over time. So before we place a modulator in, let's look at what we could modulate and talk about which modulators we might like to use to do that. So we could adjust the fine tuning of the waveform. We could adjust the frequency of the filter. And we have 3 positions we can do that in, which will all sum together to make a really interesting movement of that frequency dial. We could change the resonance or emphasis of the filtering. We could do that over time. Or we could adjust elements, again, of the amplifier. And then we've also got these 2 mysterious values here. So we already know one of the time-based things that we can do is use an envelope with our attack, decay, sustain and release values. So while we have a spare output on this envelope and before we input another type of modulator, let's try one of those out on one of the values. Let's initially try that out on the CV for the pitch input. We're going to take the second output of the envelope generator and patch it into this tuning CV2 on the oscillator. That's a bit extreme. Let's wind down this CV and see if it sounds any more kind of musical or usable for us. That adjustment's pretty cool. We can kind of make use of that. And just to give you an idea of what these other outputs are on the ADSR, it's maybe a good time to take a look at this inverse output here. So we know what happened when the ADSR was patched into the amplifier from this output. It opened over time and then closed. Let's see what happens with this pitch. It goes above the note's initial value and then drops back down over time. If we use the inverse output, I think we can kind of guess the result we're going to get. It bends into the note. It begins with a lower pitch, and then the release time, it gradually comes back up to the pitch that was given to it by the Midi to CV converter. Okay. This is going to be our LFO, or Low-Frequency Oscillator, and this is one of the key parts of modulation in an analog synth, and let's take a look at what that does. Again, we've got these wave shapes, so perhaps you'd think that maybe we could hear a similar sound to that of the VCO. Well, let's take our synth out of the main output for a moment and just patch one of these into the main output and see what we get. Well, we can see that on the output level there appears to be output, but we can't really hear anything, and that's because it's a low frequency oscillator. It's oscillating so low that it's not really within audio range. Let's see if we can turn it up to the point at which we could hear it. There we are. Even at its highest value, it's a really low rumble. I don't know if you can hear that where you are. I can hear it on my headphones. So what are we going to do with a really low rumbly waveform? Well, what we can do is apply that oscillation to other elements of the synthesizer, and although we won't hear the oscillation itself, we will hear the application of the oscillator on the element that we choose to apply it to. And that is the key to modulating these elements. So we've got a rate of modulation, that's the frequency here. We've got a CV where we can adjust that rate, we can offset it. And then we've got the waveforms, different shapes, that are going to give us, again, a different texture to that modulation, which each of those waveforms supply. We've also got a reset input. Now we can do all sorts of things with this, but the most kind of commonly used one, and the one I'm going to discuss today, is if we'd like to think about a waveform and that it has a start and end point. And so its frequency oscillation begins at 0 and then rises and falls. We may want that to occur at the point at which we play the note. So sometimes you might use a gate or trigger to reset this oscillator to start at 0 at the point at which you play the note. Also, if we're adjusting the speed of this LFO, the speed of the rate of its oscillation, we might want to do that over time. So we could do that with an envelope generator, our friend the ADSR. We could place that into this CV input and create a changing frequency oscillation of the LFO. And we could do that over time, and we could reset that by gating it at the same time as our envelope. Also, it's possible to feed back different shapes back into the LFO to feed back on itself. Now there's some limitations to this, and that's because certain waves will cancel each other out, but you can get really wild and wonderful waveforms by feeding an oscillator back to itself. But we're going to start with something simple, and let's give our oscillator a little bit of detuning over time to make that voice a little bit more interesting. So again, I'm going to take, in this case I'm going to take a sine wave, and I'm going to feed that into the CV2 of the oscillator, and this is going to adjust the pitch over time, and hopefully we should hear that little bit of a wobble. patch the output of my synth back in again. That's a little bit extreme to kind of give you an idea of exactly what's happening. But if we make that really subtle, and maybe speed it up a little bit, we start to get quite a nice texture on that note. Musically, that's what we call vibrato, this kind of changing, slight fluctuations in pitch over time. On a wind instrument, we can do that by opening and closing our mouths. On a stringed instrument, we can kind of bend the note. And in a synthesizer, we achieve this by applying a low-frequency oscillator to the pitch envelope of the oscillator, the main voltage-controlled oscillator. Let's take a look at applying that LFO to something else in the circuit and see what we get going. Let's take a saw wave and patch it into the frequency of the filter. Again, that's a little extreme. So into CV1, we're getting the full range of that low frequency oscillation. So all the way up to the top of the saw and all the way back down to the bottom. And that filter is flying open and closed. A lot like that. The benefit of this CV2 is that we can adjust the range of that effect. So let's try using CV2 instead, and we can kind of limit the effect that that LFO has. Okay, let's bring it right down. Okay. If we apply the square wave to CV3, just to illustrate that these values are then summed together so that we get a slightly different shaped waveform happening over time. Now it's difficult to ascertain really what's happening there, and that's because these two outputs are from the same LFO and are therefore going at the same rate. So, as we build up our synthesizer, we might want to add more stages of modulation to allow us to do modulations that occur at different times. So let's add another LFO and see if we can make those adjustments differ in rate and see what effect that has. Let's take this one out. Where are you going to? There you are. Let's get that square, put it in here, and kind of speed it up. I'll raise that triangle, saw. Let's raise that sawtooth value. And now you can hear both of those adjustments happening simultaneously on the filter frequency. And hopefully that's starting to give you a picture of how you could build up those combinations of different rates and different shapes of low frequency oscillations to kind of sum together to make really interesting sounds on your filter frequency. Put the resonance in for a bit of fun. Okay, well those are pretty extreme adjustments, but hopefully it illustrates kind of the practical application of them a little bit. I'd like to go back at this point and just look at this output here, and this is our square wave, because there's a couple of controls here that we haven't really looked at. So let's take a look at those. They only apply to the square. And what it is it's pulse width modulation. So the square, if we listen to the square wave, I'm filtering a little too much of it at the moment. There we go. The square wave oscillates between two extreme points, the top and the bottom of the waveform. So where you can see the other waveforms move between the highest point and the lowest point in curves over time, you can see that the square wave shoots immediately from top to bottom in its oscillation. And the pulse width modulation allows you to adjust the width of this high and low pulse. So let's kind of have a little play and move the pulse width so you can get an idea of the timbres that you can get with it. Straight away you start to recognize, maybe some of the tones that you get on these bass synths, where you get that pulse width modulation. Maybe if you're trying to emulate a kind of string sound, what we can do now is not just set that pulse width modulation, but we can move it over time using our LFO. So let's take a look. We'll take a smooth output here from the sine wave and see what we get. Again, when we've fed that straight into CV1, we've got the full value. There's no limiting happening here. This is changing the pulse width from high to low across the amount of this sine wave at its frequency. It sounds quite extreme, but if we feed it instead to CV2, we can limit that. Usable sound. There are other ways that we can limit those signals, and in other patches I will take a look at those, but hopefully this is giving you a kind of building blocks approach to what you might be able to do to build your own voicings. Just before I leave this tutorial, because I think we've got plenty to be kind of working from at this point to start making your own voices, I'd like to take a look at another way we can adjust this LFO to adjust the rate of it. I'll just take one of these out, simplify it and make sure we know what we're looking at. I'm going to add another envelope generator. With this envelope generator, I'm not going to be opening or closing an amplifier. I'm going to take this envelope and I'm going to adjust the CV input of this LFO, and let's see what happens to this LED here when we give it a time-based effect. So I'm going to trigger it with the gate from my Midi to CV converter, and that's going to start the envelope when I press a key. And I'm going to take the output and put it into the CV input of the LFO. Give that some CV, and let's see, if we watch carefully, watch that LED there, see what happens when I press. Now, a note triggered, but nothing happened to the sound because I haven't outputted, but hopefully you could see that the rate of this adjusted quite dramatically. If I drop the frequency down a little bit, so we've got a really slow rate there. Let's patch this again into the pulse width modulation. Sorry, into CV2. We don't want it to go too wild. Turn it up a bit. Okay, here we go. I'll raise the frequency a little bit. Drop the effect. not a particularly pleasant sound, but hopefully I'm illustrating the point that this LFO now has its own time-based feature triggered by this envelope generator. So where initially the LFO had a fixed rate, we're now able to adjust how long it takes to get to that, what rate it's at once it sustains, and how long it takes to drop back down to its initial rate. I'll take another output, maybe tune it to the actual tuning of the waveform. Starting to get something a little more musical now. Might take a little bit to the filter. Again, you can really hear there that envelope generator affecting that LFO over time. So you've got a very dynamic modulation because it's got an attack, decay, sustain and release rather than just that fixed rate. Make it a bit more subtle, put it into CV2. Okay, I'm going to leave it there for today. Hopefully that's useful to somebody out there who's maybe not known what those units do. Yeah, not a great sound, I give you that. But hopefully demonstrating the various features of the VCO oscillator, the VCF filter, the VCA amplifier, the ADSR envelope generator, the low frequency oscillator LFO, and kind of some of the ways in which we can modulate those over time and patch into the various inputs. And you can see already that with just those 5 modules, the possibilities are endless. You know, we can, with a single oscillator, one voice synthesizer, we can make an endless world of tones from that. And once you start applying effects, delays, reverbs, you know, it's just an incredible palette of sound design at your disposal. So yeah, hopefully you'll tune in again and we'll start to look at maybe some more interesting patches and maybe aim for something a little more musical next time. And yeah, thanks for tuning in.